I would love if we start by just you telling me a little bit about yourself.
Well, today, 2.5 weeks after my son Sagui was freed from Hamas captivity, I can once again sort of think of myself as an actual person and not just the father
Not
of
just
a
the
hostage.
father of.
So I'm at the moment a 61-year-old father of four, grandfather of 13,
Wow.
big wow, a lifelong kibbutznik since 17, 8 years old, 18 years old, married to a wonderful woman, second marriage, who lives in the States. Um, I'm a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and work in history, international relations. But that's a second or third career. My first love um, was working on the farm on Kibbutz Nir Oz, where we all lived on until October 7th, 2023. And in between, for a few years, on Kibbutz Kishur, in the Golan Heights, which was for me a kind of moment in life when I wanted to be part of creating a new kibbutz and not just inhabiting or joining an older veteran kibbutz. Um,
Tell us
so
a little tiny bit about life in Nir Oz. You said you've been there since the 80s.
Yeah, I first arrived on Nir Oz in the early 1980s as part of a youth group trip, of all things, that no longer exists, but through the Reform Movement youth movement. At the time, there was a 6 month trip for kids who had finished high school early, and I guess to stay out of trouble, they brought
Hmm.
us to Israel for 6 months, and that was my first time in Israel. The first 3 months were spent in Jerusalem learning Hebrew, living with local families in the Katamon neighborhood, which is nothing like it is. It was then nothing like it is right now.
Mm.
At the time, it was a sort of a working class neighborhood populated by immigrants and their children, mostly from North Africa, from Muslim lands. And after those first 3 months, which were wonderful living in Jerusalem, we went as a group to Nir Oz and served there kind of as volunteers, lived our own independent lives. And that's when my love affair with kibbutz life began. And there was a year in between that I went back to the States. But as of mid 1982, I was back in Israel. Um, Knew for sure that I needed to return to a kibbutz. It wound up being a new kibbutz in the Golan Heights, Kibbutz Shur, and I went into the army shortly thereafter as a kind of, well, a stage in becoming a true citizen of the country. And for better or worse, was my mandatory service in the army was during the first Lebanon War,
Wow.
um, which was a stark awakening into the realities of the Middle East.
And another part of kind of those realities was life at Nir Oz.
Later on, yeah, my wife and I, my first wife, the mother of my kids, we moved from Kshur down to Nir Oz, something that I was already familiar with for all sorts of reasons. In I think April of 1990. By that time, we had four kids, young. And we went there with eyes wide open. It was on the border, but the border at the time in 1990 was, of course, not the border that developed over time once Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007. And then our reality changed very radically.
Can you tell us a little bit about that new reality?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about the old reality first. When I was a kid, 17, 18 years old, on Near Oz, it was kind of an idyllic time in life and an idyllic place to be. It's, for those people who aren't familiar with it, it's like the Garden of Eden, truly in the middle of the desert. It's a botanical garden. It's an actual botanical garden, the residential part of Near Oz, amid these vast open agricultural fields along the border with Gaza, about a kilometer and a half, a mile from the border. And when I was a kid, there was this practice because, of course, the relations were completely different with the people of Gaza. Um, during the summer months, which is when I was there initially, um, the young people of the kibbutz would load up on a tractor and a wagon after work and just drive to the beach in Khan Yunis
Wow.
and, buy, pitot along the way and some juice and whatever we wanted and just hang out on the beach in Khan Yunis. There was a fence between Israel and Gaza, but it was the silly little like goat fence, not much more than that, and felt pretty at home at the time. That was a lifetime ago, and of course things changed over time with the first Intifada and other things that happened along the way. But as I said, things changed radically with the Hamas coup in Gaza in 2007, and within I would say weeks and months at the most, um, Hamas began firing homemade rudimentary rockets in our direction, and all of the kibbutzim along the border, within a kilometer or two, were reachable by these rudimentary rockets. And over time, um, these developed into sort of a reality of life. Um, and over time, the threats became more significant from rudimentary objects to weapons grade munitions that were smuggled into Gaza from all sorts of places. And that expanded over time in the 2010s into attack tunnels being um, being dug under the border from Gaza into Israel. Multiple attack tunnels like this were discovered right in front of Nir Oz. Sniper fire directly across the border, anti-tank fire directly across the border. The last sort of stage was incendiary kites, balloons, and explosive kites and balloons that would just get sailed over in attempts to light our fields on fire or to even do damage. We had a few just land in public areas on the kibbutz in the swimming pool.
Wow.
And so it was a constant danger. We had to warn our kids, do not approach kites. I mean, think about this, what a way to live to bring up kids, in my case, grandkids, not to approach kites or balloons because they were a danger because of the devices that terrorists and I guess just regular people from Gaza were attaching. There were occasional escalations of violence. The biggest single one was culminated in Operation Protective Edge.
Mm.
But over, let's say, from 2008 up to 2000, October 2023, I'm going to guess there were about 4 or 5 of these escalations where we had to evacuate the whole kibbutz.
Wow.
All the women, all the children, most of the older folks, and a lot of say people who didn't need to be there.
Yeah.
We evacuated to safer parts of the country in the interior for a few days, a month, 2 months, depending on how long these operations and these escalations occurred. There was always an expectation on our part that we can protect ourselves up to a certain point. There was no way for us to be able to protect ourselves against, you know, dozens of rockets and mortars, all military grade, being shot directly at us, and
Mm.
hence the evacuations in some cases were just, in all cases, were really mandatory. Um, and this cycle continued for years and years.
And cycled up to October 7th?
Well, October 7th is a different animal.
Really?
It's a different, of course, yeah. There were one that, for lack of imagination, and no one in our senior Army command or in the intelligence services ever took seriously. This idea of a full-scale invasion, not projectiles being lobbed over or explosive devices being lobbed over, or the occasional, pot shot from a sniper, or even an attack tunnel, which suggested it. But even then, I don't think the thinking was that there were going to be thousands of terrorists um, breaching the border simultaneously, completely surprising and overwhelming. Just a few soldiers that were stationed along the border, then being followed by many thousands more of looters, which were just as destructive as the terrorists themselves. So this was entirely different, and the results we see before us.
Can you tell us about your experience of that day?
Personally, I was by pure chance. I was not on the kibbutz. I was not in the country. I was on my way to attending a scholarly workshop in the States. My experience of that day was being woken up pretty early by a friend in the States on that Saturday morning, so the morning of October 7th, um, asking me and my wife, what's going on? And
Wow.
we had no idea what she was talking about. And she evidently she was up very early and had been watching CNN or some other channel and was seeing footage, not from Near Oz, but just generally from what was going on in the South. And she was very concerned. She had also been with us on Near Oz when we were kids in
Mm,
1981. So she had a personal connection. She'd visited as well in later years. And that's when my October 7th began. Had I been on the kibbutz on October 7th, we wouldn't be talking right now. The what I know now about that day on Nir Oz, in all probability, almost certainly, I would have been killed or taken hostage. It's a near certainty. So I tried to get in touch, of course, once I understood that something terrible was going on. Tried to get in touch with my kids on the kibbutz, and it took a while because it was still in the midst of the massacre on Nir Oz, keeping in mind that Nir Oz is the only kibbutz, the only community, the only place where the army never arrived. The IDF never came. By the time the IDF, the first units, reached Nir Oz, it was 2:30 in the afternoon and the terrorists had already left. They had done whatever they wanted to do. The looters were also pretty much gone. The IDF didn't fire a shot in Nir Oz. So this rampage continued for many hours. By the time I called, it was about 12:30 in the afternoon um, on the kibbutz, and it was very difficult. I was not able to contact. I didn't even try actually contacting Sagui because I knew there was nothing I could do to help and he would be busy, trying to protect his family, and he didn't need a call from his dad from the other side of the earth. I did try to call his wife. There was no answer. I was able to connect with my son-in-law and my daughter, who lived 50 feet from me on the kibbutz with her two kids. He did pick up the phone and he gave me a brief update on what was happening. The kibbutz was still under assault. There were terrorists rampaging throughout the kibbutz. Um, Sometime shortly before that, my ex-wife, Noamit, had been able to escape from captivity. She has a sort of heroic story on her own. She was taken captive with
wow.
all the other people from the kibbutz. She and one other woman, Batsheva Yaalomi, different episodes, but same idea, were able to escape their captors.
Wow.
Noamit, my ex-wife, was injured, seriously injured, with a lot of shrapnel, a lot of bleeding around the border with Gaza, but was able to make her way slowly but surely back to the kibbutz and was able to join my daughter in her bomb shelter, where she got sort of first aid from my son-in-law and guests of theirs who were sheltering with them. And thank God she survived. She almost bled out.
Wow.
Um, yeah. And the next contact I had with my kids was probably around 5 p.m. There was a process once the army arrived and in larger numbers, let's say 3:30. Um, they began a process of clearing the kibbutz and sort of liberating the survivors and bringing them into a central space, which was a large hardened building on the kibbutz, children's house, a large children's house. And there people could recharge their phones. It was one of the few places that still had electricity because the terrorists had cut the electricity to most of the kibbutz. They had incredibly detailed intelligence about the kibbutz. I mean, really like granular intelligence. So they were able to cut most of the electricity by the time the phones recharged. So around 5 in the evening, I was able to speak with my daughter, who was there with all of the folks, and she was telling me that there were a lot of people missing. A lot was still unclear. The kibbutz was destroyed, um, and Sagi was missing. She didn't yet. She did know that my daughter and Sagi's wife and two daughters, aged 2 and 6 at the time, were okay. Um, but no one knew what had happened with Sagi, and it will take about a week before the army notified us that they could say definitively that he was a hostage. That was a common fate. In the end, we had 79 hostages, a community of a little over 400 people altogether. Um, on that day, I don't have the exact numbers, but I believe I can get you the numbers. Something close, 45 people were murdered that day, confirmed murdered on that day. We now know that about 9 bodies were taken, um, murdered kibbutzniks were taken to Gaza as hostages, bargaining chips. So a total of 79 hostages were taken, Sagi among them. And for many of them, because there was no evidence of them having been taken, there was no footage of them being taken, it was unclear if they were missing or hostages. So we got a little bit of clarity about a week or so after the massacre. And we got our first proof of life from Sagi in late November, early December. There was a first agreement, hostage release agreement with Hamas, brokered by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt in late November, early December. And there were a little over 100 women and children released, a couple of men and some Thai workers, but altogether about 104. Of that general number, 40 were from our kibbutz,
Wow.
women and kids. Uh, a handful of those women and teenagers were able to tell us that they had encountered Sagi very briefly and some other male kibbutz members very, very briefly before their release. And they could tell us then, and we're talking about early December at the latest, they were able to tell us that he was alive. He had been wounded. We knew that from the forensic evidence in his home. Um, but that his wounds, at least in a very basic way, had been treated. But that's all they could tell us because they'd only encountered him for a few hours. Um, and there was no positive evidence of proof of life until we saw him get out of the that van in Khan Yunis on the day of the exchange, I think the 14th of February.
I want to ask you more about that moment, but first, let's go back. Can you tell me about finding out that he's supposed to be released? And maybe about your state of mind because you've been living in months and months of, like you said, severe uncertainty about
Yeah.
what his situation is.
Well, it was, we could breathe a little, but having experienced everything that all hostage families and really most of the country had been experiencing, there was no absolute certainty. The fact that Hamas announced that he was alive, it's difficult giving any faith
Yeah.
to a murderous terrorist organization. And beyond that, in earlier stages of the release, we had seen that there were a lot of bumps in the road that had threatened whether or not that this or that release was going to going to happen. And in fact, that was really the character of that week before his physical release was pretty terrible. And for all the people who had hostages in Gaza, certainly those who were supposed to be released in the first stage, with a lot of noise coming from Hamas and from our own government. Um, about the stalled process and new demands and all sorts of things like that. So it was a very, very stressful few days until that Saturday and we also didn't know, quite honestly, assuming that that release was going to go through, what condition he would be in. We had seen a week earlier, or in the 2 previous weeks, horrific scenes of the hostage releases. And how these men looked upon their release. Um, for me, it was doubly daunting, really, because part of my background is that my two parents, well, my dad was a Holocaust survivor. My mom was a Holocaust refugee from Nazi Germany. And my dad survived somehow 6 years of Nazi occupation, ghettoization, slave labor, and death march. And so by the time he was freed in April, late April of 1945, he looked very much like the hostages who had been released the 2 weeks before Sagui. And quite honestly, my mind was full of all sorts of scenarios. What if Sagui also came out looking like those men? Thank God for reasons that, one day we may understand. Sagi and the two hostages who were released with him, Yair and Sasha, both from Kibbutz Nir Oz, had suffered dearly, but they didn't look like Elisha Arabi and those folks. So that in itself was a relief, and he could walk on his 2 feet. We had no idea. We knew that he had been shot in the leg amongst his wounds from October 7th. We had no idea if he could walk on his own 2 feet and what his condition would be.
And then you see him walk out of that car, and tell us a little bit about that moment.
It's an absolute. There aren't words really, and I mean I know some languages. I don't have the vocabulary to describe really. I'm a man of words to describe that feeling. It's like having a 36-year-old son be born again. He's emerging from this white man, but emerging from the valley of death, quite literally. So, joy, such a thin word to describe that. And we're still experiencing it now in, every moment um, that we have with him. And to see his daughter's faces, especially the two older ones who miss their dad terribly. The little one, you know, she's a year and 3 months old. What does she know? And we knew, well, even then, I mean, we saw him from a distance, of course, through cameras. So it was difficult to know
Mm.
sort of what his condition was. And there was no sound as well. And so it was difficult to know. It was horrific watching that ceremony. Um, Incredibly painful to watch that and what these three guys and all of the others were put through after a year and a half in hell. Um, and you just sit there helplessly, and it's agonizing for them. The agony is for them that they would be put through this. To say nothing of what Gadi Moses and Arbel Yehud were put through. They're also from our kibbutz. Gadi's been my
Yeah.
friend for 45 years.
Wow.
I've watched Arbel grow since she was born. Just didn't know what to expect. I knew it was Sagi, that's my boy, and not a
Yeah.
shadow of himself. In our first meeting, and there's a video record of it, at the army base in Re'im, which is where the army has the families meet, all of the returnees. And I looked in his eyes. I was only third in line to give him a hug. First his wife, obviously, and then his mom, and then me. But I was looking from the side to just sort of take a measure of him. I saw immediately that that was him. Because Sagi, and I've said this repeatedly, but Sagi has always spoken with his eyes since he was a little kid. And I could see my boy's eyes, and I knew he was he was okay. That was him. Surely lots to overcome, but that was it.
So, obviously, only what you can share are comfortable sharing. We don't want to encroach on Siggy's privacy, but anything that he told you about captivity that you can share.
Well, I would say the pillars of this story are common
Hmm.
amongst all of the returnees, and we have a lot from Nir Oz, so it's, I can kind of make a broader statement here. There are particulars of Sagi's situation and some things in, that were just common. The common things are that, look, 500 days or nearly 500 days with no sunlight,
Wow.
no sunlight. He never saw the sun for
Wow.
497 days. That does something to the human body, no
Mm.
matter what. Malnutrition, chronic malnutrition. What they got was not a lot to eat and to drink, and what it was, it wasn't nutritious. It was just to basically keep them alive. Little, if any, medical treatment beyond a couple of operations that he had very early on in Khan Yunis. Sanitary conditions that are better left uh, unsaid, and the constant fear of death. Every moment, every second of every day. Sagui calculated that he was captive for 43 million seconds, and
Wow.
he felt every one of them, that this could be his last. From two sources, the obvious, from the terrorists, his captors. And we know that there's evidence of that. Hirsch Goldberg Poland and the other 5 young people were executed. And there are other examples of this as well by their captors for whatever reasons. But what also must be emphasized is that he had, and I'm sure many other hostages as well, near death experiences as a result of friendly fire, as
Mm.
a result of aerial bombings or perhaps artillery shells from the IDF. As hard as I know they try to avoid anywhere in Gaza that hostages may be held, um, things happen. And on multiple occasions, he was able to tell us that he was very close to death because of friendly fire. And which, of course, emphasizes the need to get the hostages out in some sort of negotiated way. Continuing warfare, the very warfare itself, puts them at risk from direct fire and from the threat of Israeli encroachment on the places where the hostages are being held, which would lead and has led to hostages being executed. The particulars for him was that he arrived wounded, seriously wounded, and he had to deal over those nearly 500 days with keeping himself healthy and not contracting, infections that could kill him. He was aware of that, and so he had to work with the resources that he had there to um, keep himself healthy in ways that most other hostages did not, with gunshot wounds or shrapnel wounds, things like that. So that's what I can tell you in sort of both the general and the particular about his captivity.
If you're willing to share, I would love to hear about how you're doing since he's been back.
There's like the question you asked about Sagi. There's the common and then there's a particular. The common is that for anyone whose hostage comes back alive, there is the joy of rebirth. And in our case, of course, the double joy, and words don't capture it, to see Sagi back with his girls and to meet his youngest daughter,
Born while he was in
born while he
captivity.
was, yes, understanding that he did not know. The hostages in the tunnels are in information vacuums. He was able to surmise that Avital and the girls had survived only 2 days before he was released.
Wow.
He was in an absolute information vacuum. Um, he only learned that Shahar was born after he crossed the border and met the first Israeli soldiers around the Kisufim border crossing, the exchange between the Red Cross and the IDF. That's where he heard that he didn't know. Not only had his wife survived, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, or whether she ever was able to give birth. So our world, we have, I guess the best way to describe it, there's oxygen again in the air and light around us, where there was only darkness and an inability to breathe for 497 days. So I think that's true pretty much of all of the families and loved ones of released hostages. I would imagine, must be. For us, however, in the certainly on Nir Oz, people from the kibbutzim, there's a different layer that, or a separate layer that, let's say, hostage families from the Nova Festival, or even army soldiers, although they haven't released any soldiers yet, and that's the communal part of this, because amongst the hostages, there are so many murder victims from our kibbutz. We have been attending funerals of kibbutz people now for a year and a half. And certainly since this first stage of the deal was completed, it seems like every other day we are attending a funeral of someone who was murdered in captivity, meaning these are people who were taken alive from Nir Oz, documented, no question. And whether it was just a few weeks or months, they were alive. They could have been saved. And they died. They were allowed to die in Hamas captivity. Hamas is to blame. There's no question about that. They are murder victims, but they could have been saved had we reached and we've been able to reach an agreement beforehand. They didn't have to die like this.
You said allowed to die.
Yes, because we feel, and I think the hostage community and most of Israel, judging by the polls in Israel for many, many months now, believe that this government, our government, whoever you voted for, is responsible. Obviously, always was responsible both for what happened on October 7th, although it's taken no accountability. Um, the government and the army are responsible for these people. And the only way to get them out, and there's absolute proof of concept, is through a negotiated deal. Certainly all those who have been held underground. And so not getting to that negotiated deal, whether it was on October 8th or any time thereafter, is the government's responsibility. It's choices that this government made and continues to make. And so for us, we still have, we had 79 originally, hostages, most of them alive, some had already been murdered. Today we have 14 just from Nir Oz. Of the 59 total hostages while we speak, there are 14 from Nir Oz. 9 of them are confirmed dead. Some of them died in captivity. Some of them, their bodies were taken from Nir Oz. And so for us, nothing is over. Nothing. And as a very tight-knit community like kibbutzim are, these people are our extended family. These are people that I've worked with my entire adult life. They've been my neighbors. They've been my, they're my kids basically. And so the horror of having to bury these people, knowing that they were alive when they were taken. Obviously people, rightfully so, focus on the Bibas family, who lived 100 feet from me.
Wow.
I watched Shiri grow up. I worked with her dad, who was murdered with his wife. I worked with her dad for years. Ariel, the older boy, was over my house, once or twice a week with one of my grandsons, who was his best friend, to get sweets and ice cream, and he was like my adopted grandson. All of this is deeply personal for us, but there are so many others like this, dear friends who were murdered, some of whom we've been able to bury in Israel, in our land, and others await that. And we can't really begin to live again until they're all home. And then there's that whole other layer of loss, the loss of our home. In Be'eri, in Nahal Oz, in Kfar Aza, which were the 3 other kibbutzim that, if I'm not missing anyone, who had major invasions. The destruction was only of a couple of neighborhoods and maybe a public building, a communal building or two. Near Oz, there was total destruction. It is uninhabitable and will be uninhabitable for years. Our way of life is gone. We have a surviving community. Most of it is here in Kiryat Gat for the time being. But we lost everything we knew. Um, People, a way of life, our property. Some people left near Oz with literally nothing. Their homes were burned to the ground. Um, and so our experience of October 7th and everything that has followed is, I'm not talking in terms of better or worse, but profoundly different than pretty much anyone else in Israel, including hostage families. And I only wish them the best. And I've been working and continue to work very hard on advocacy for all of the hostages. But there is something qualitative going on here that in Israel, there's not a ton of awareness about it because the government has made a point of kind of erasing the destruction of the kibbutzim in the public eye. Prime Minister has yet to visit Kibbutz Nir Oz or speak with us directly, despite inviting him many, many times. Um, so it is a challenge for us, every day and moving forward.
Can you tell me a bit more about that? About this, you're describing a total abandonment by the government that is ongoing and not been fixed. Can you tell me more about the impact on the community, on you?
Well,
Are
we
there
feel
thoughts of leaving the
well,
country?
I don't know about that. Life is basically stopped until all of our hostages come home. Look, we felt abandoned before October 7th. Um, your listeners, your readers may or may not be aware of it. And I've written about this. I mean, it's not something that I'm inventing as a result of October 7th. There are two Israels. There has been now for many, many decades. And I've seen it develop over my lifetime in Israel. There is the Israel of, a portion of the coastal strip and Jerusalem that receives a disproportionate amount of funding and government attention. And then there's everything else. And the everything else in the peripheries is has been pretty much neglected. Promises aside, has been pretty much neglected. Now, truth be told, this is a long-term problem. Benjamin Netanyahu or this government didn't invent this gap, but it's built and had become much more serious as a result of the specific coalitions that he had put together over time since 1996 and their priorities versus the needs of the country as a whole. We felt pretty much abandoned, certainly since 2008, when we had to fend for ourselves for the most part and figuring out how to deal with an ever present daily danger from Gaza. We had to figure almost everything out on our own. Services that were promised were not delivered. Even basic security was neglected by the government. And so you hear from the kibbutzim along the border that the government refused to give them adequate weapons to defend themselves on their security teams or communications equipment. It's an abomination, and it had been an abomination before October 7th. Part of the colossal failure of October 7th and the degree of the massacre was a result not just of this extensive planning by Hamas and but also by government neglect and a lack of recognition by the government and the army of what the needs really are, on the periphery of the country. And I suppose it's only natural that that neglect continues after October 7th. Lip service aside, and political posturing aside, uh, actual engagement and actual solutions um, simply aren't there because of the government has different priorities.
We've discussed kind of what's lacking from the government. Can we talk a bit about what you've seen from the people, what you'd like to see from the people?
It's been an extraordinary experience from my perspective. Um, other than very, very right wing fringe people who are goaded on by some of our ministers, the vast majority of Israelis, whatever their background, whatever their political orientation, whatever their religious orientation, have been embracing of the hostage families, um, and generally speaking, our communities, the kibbutz community. We feel it here in Kiryat Gat, and I feel it wherever I go in the country. We've made a conscious effort, certainly from the family perspective, but many other families in the hostage community, to reach out to the national religious community, as an example. And I know that there's been enormous progress towards a kind of conciliation. It's incredibly tragic that it took, this awful, inhumane crisis to produce it, but this is ground up. It's ground up, which is more promising than empty promises from politicians. In fact, it's almost in conflict with the political positions taken by many of the national religious politicians. This reconciliation between communities and recognition that national religious community in Israel as a whole, not just in some particular geographic part of Israel, but as a whole, and the kibbutz community have so much more in common as human beings. Our basic values are so much more similar than not. And it's horrific that it took this crisis to bring that recognition, but it's happening. It's happening. And if there is some kind of small silver lining in what has happened to all of us, but certainly the hostage community in the last year and a half, that might be part of it. That there might be a better future of fewer divisions. But again, it's ground up. Our politicians, all of our politicians, all of them, do not do us proper service in terms of finding the common ground and not just trying to score political points with whatever their base has to be.
You, the hostage families, even the returned hostages themselves, have been forced into these positions as spokespeople and advocates for the other hostages. Can you touch on that a little bit?
It's one of the great ironies, and I feel betrayals of our world since October 6th or 7th. In a perfect world, the biggest single advocates for the hostages in action and not just lip service will be the government of Israel. That simply hasn't happened. And as a result, hostage families themselves have had to take it on, collectively and individually, each one trying to figure out sort of where their voice would be most effective. Um, History will not judge, speaking as a historian of the Jewish people, history will not judge these leaders well for what they've already done and what I fear they might continue to do. Time will tell about what the future holds. I think history will also not look kindly on some, not all, on some of the leaderships of major Jewish organizations, and in North America, certainly. Their inability or unwillingness or fear of working on behalf of the Jewish people, even if, even if that in some way conflicts, they believe, perhaps, with the Israeli government. All of these organizations, all of them, were created for the betterment of the people of Israel. The people of Israel, not this or that politician in Israel. And for the most part, not all, for the most part, major Jewish organizations have failed in that regard. Not just the hostage families, but the Jewish people as a whole. And I don't think history will judge them well either at this moment.
Can you describe a little bit that failure of the Jewish organizations abroad?
Understanding that both in looking backwards at the history of the Jewish people around solidarity and around hostages, looking at the present around what's really important for the Jewish people and the Israeli people, and looking forward to what it means to leave hostages for the Jewish people what it means to consciously, what it would mean to consciously allow hostages to die in captivity of a terrorist organization. And I think the damage could be irreparable to the basic values of Jews everywhere.
So
All in favor of in their some of these cases, without naming names, being afraid to simply do the right thing and state clearly, publicly, not criticism of the Israeli government. That I understand. That's not their role. And but to state clearly that this actually is a irrefutable Jewish value. B'dion shvuim, the ransoming, or the, if need be. This has been a practice in Jewish history for over 1,000 years, and never with friendly governments or friendly states, always with problematic to despicable parties. I mean, we don't have to ransom captives from Switzerland. Obviously, it's going to be with problematic parties. The abandonment of that principle in favor of um, anything, turf wars, fear of anger from within their own communities and their own positions in leadership, I think is an embarrassment. And again, I'm sure history will not judge them well. There's still time for course correction.
it's like
And
I just want to get at what it is. It's a failure to make this unequivocal statement
yes,
and
that's
push
it.
for a deal.
An unpolitical, not criticizing any politician anywhere, but just to put the force, such as it is, of the Jewish organizational world behind prioritizing above all else getting these hostages home, those who are still alive and those who must be brought back to Israel to be buried by their loved ones.